Hey everyone, welcome back. In this Selenium with Java framework tutorial, we are going to learn about data-driven testing, and then we will also see there are a few more hard-coded values in our script, how we can remove them, and along with that, how you can do data-driven testing and what exactly we mean when we say data-driven testing. So this is the script, very simple one, and this is what we are referring and trying to convert with reference to this script into a framework. So basically, what are the pain point and challenges in a single script? We are working backwards and then seeing the challenges and then converting it to the framework and seeing the benefits side by side. So we have externalized these locators, right? So now locators are in a separate file, central file. If locator get changed or developer do some certain changes, then we can basically, like go into the central file, do the changes, and all our script will get updated without any issues, or they'll get the latest information. Similar thing is true for any hard-coded data as well. So as you can see, the highlighted username and the highlighted password in the script is hard-coded in the script. Now, if there are 100 scripts in my project and all of them require login for basically doing further processing, so there might be different user roles and different login details for each of these user roles. Now, if you start hard-coding these into your script, the username and password, it's again same issue that we have seen with these locators. So say for example, the password got expired, it got changed, you will keep updating these in all the scripts, which is a nightmare. So we also need to remove any hard-coded data from a script to the file, right? To a central file from where we can pick it up and do the testing. So we'll start from very basic. We'll start from TestNG data-driven annotation that is being provided within TestNG, which is DataProvider @DataProvider, and then eventually we'll move on to the externalizing these details to the Excel file. That's what our framework will be using. Say for example, I am using the test data for login test, then my test data is there in the Excel sheet into the login sheet, right? So all the login details are in the login sheet. Then there is some other data, it's there in the central Excel file, and I do not need to worry about what's there in my script. Script has just a reference of the user role and it will be able to pick it up from the Excel file. So first thing, or let's understand the default TestNG functionality that is being provided to perform data-driven testing within our TestNG framework. So as we are using TestNG testing framework with this particular Selenium framework, so we'll simply use the data provider. So I'll go to the TestNG website and I'll show you what I mean when we say data provider. So let me find data provider and should be fine, right? So we can basically, what we can do with data provider is we can provide data to any test, right? So this is basically saying if we want to perform data driven testing, when we say data driven testing, it is basically, say for example, you want to iterate through the data. So if there is a registration functionality, so you want to register 100 users on a web portal, then you provide the user data for each of these users, and there is a single script that populates all that data, right? Picking up the rows from the Excel sheet or from the data provider and populates all that data into the form and submits the form, right? Or does the user registration. So you do not have to rewrite the script 100 times and hard code 100% or 100 people's data in those 100 test cases. Single test case is enough as far as you have this data driven approach implemented, and that's what we are going to look with this data provider approach first. Now data provider is baby step. Basically you can use it, but in complex frameworks you will be eventually moving to the Excel sheets. So how we can implement a data provider? Simply in our test case we just need to include this @DataProvider and provide the name of the data provider. You can provide any name, right? And then we simply provide whatever data our script or our test case needs, right? So say for example, let's go to Eclipse. Now this particular test case requires username and password. These are the two hard-coded values in this particular test, right? So we want to provide different username and password. Say for example, I want to test for valid username, invalid password, invalid username, valid password. So different scenarios, 4 or 5 scenarios, and I want to verify whether the user is able to log in with different combinations or not, or appropriate error message is displayed if username or password are incorrect. So I do not need to rewrite this script multiple times for doing those tests. So I can simply say data provider, right, in the script in the same test case, and I will provide the name. So I'll simply say the name of this data provider is, I'll say test data, say for example. Okay, and then let's go back. So you'll see that @data provider and the name of the data provider. Okay, so after that what we need to do is we need to simply specify the method. Okay, so I'll say public, and then because this data provider will return two-dimensional data, so I have created a detailed video on TestNG tutorial series, which is like 22 videos altogether. I would highly recommend you guys go ahead and watch this particular series, right? So if you'll go to this series, this whole Selenium WebDriver series, and this has overall, let me stop this, this has overall 131 videos, and it has this TestNG series within it, right? So from 1 till there are 20 videos of TestNG, so it explains everything about TestNG, right? So highly recommended, watch it, and then this data provider, all the annotation concept will be clear for TestNG. So I provided the name, and here I will simply say, because this will return two-dimensional object, so I'll say public object, and I'll say the name of the method, so I'll say test data, and within this I will simply specify that I want the data whatever I will be providing, so I'll simply say return, and within this I will provide the data, right? So if you'll see this documentation here as well, you simply have to specify, or I can simply copy this, right, and then whatever data I want to provide I can replace here as well. Okay, so it simply defines a method for creating the data or providing that data, and then return that data, whatever data we are defining here. So this is first set of data, this second set of data, we are returning that, right? And you'll see this error data provider, so simply hover over it and import this data provider from org TestNG annotations. Okay, so click on that and you will see that error has gone. Now we want the data to be returned, right? So data set that you want to pass, you need to pass within the curly braces. Okay, so what we are going to pass, we are going to pass the username, right? So provide the username there, comma separated, and the password. Okay, and we'll say comma separated password there. Okay, so this is first set of data. Now say for example I have to pass similarly multiple sets of data. Okay, so I'll simply make a copy of these, and after each set comma separated, that's what we are going to basically provide, right? This is not required. So here let me do some changes here. Okay, so we can see that it is actually typing in incorrect data there, right, or some different data there, and we can basically see the details, right? So the last row of data is basically the correct set of data, but rest all is incorrect. Okay, so this is basically how we are going to specify, right, the data set, right? And then we have to use this colon after the data has been, so after this we have to make sure that it is closed. Okay, so if we simply see the hierarchy here, right, so this is the data method that is providing the data set that we have defined here, right? So this is basically, consider this as a Excel sheet which has 4 rows and 2 columns, and each of these this column will be providing username, right, and this column is the password column, and these are the rows within the sheet. So that's how you can basically look at this particular data provider. Now this is the default TestNG functionality, and to use this data provider within your test case, you can directly define this data with the data provider annotation within your script, and then from your script you can remove these hard-coded username and password. Okay, so how you can do it? You can now basically say, now first thing before that, how will this test know that this particular test has to use this data provider? So with the test annotation, right, you have to specify data provider, right, and provide the name of the data provider, right? So this is the name of the data provider. You simply say data provider within the test annotation, right? And now this particular annotation knows that this test has to use this test data that is defined here. Okay, So now this particular test knows this. Now in order to use this username and password here, what we need to do is we need to pass this username from the data provider. And how we will pass this? Now because we know that this particular data provider provides the two-dimensional array, it will provide the username and password. So there are two values that will be passed. So here in the login test, we need to catch those values, right? So whatever this particular data provider will be passing to this test, this method needs to catch them and use them into the test case, right? So how will this be possible? Now because these are the string values, right? So we simply, within this particular test, we simply define two parameters. We'll say string username, right, where the username returned by this particular data set will be stored, right, and then string password. Okay, so now these two parameters that we have defined will hold the sent data from the data provider, okay, which is test data in this test. So first iteration will happen and this data will be provided. This rc@gmail will be stored here and this password will be stored in the password. And now we can pass this here and here, right? So instead of hard coding these values, now we can simply say send keys username in place of username and then send keys. Okay, so now if you try to analyze this whole code here, we have defined all our data into the data provider using data provider annotation with different rows and columns there, and then this test identifies that it has to use this particular test data, which is the data provider name, test data, and this data will then be caught and stored here in the string username and password and then passed on to the values where it has been referred. In the first iteration, this set will be picked up, second this one, third this, and fourth this. So with this data provider annotation, 4 executions will happen with this different set of data, right? So now with this approach, I do not have to basically go ahead and repeat this particular test case for different test scenarios. Okay, so this is the beauty of data driven testing and data provider annotation. Okay, now this is the starting point. I'll refine it and we'll understand how you are going to use XML or place this data into XML and use it, because as this increases or as you have more scripts in your test cases, then you might not be, or this approach might not be very useful, because anyways, say for example, you have 20 test cases or 100 test cases and each test case or each test class has this data provider within it, then still you are sort of hard coding the data within the test case itself. There is no central repository of the data, right? So we will eventually move to that path, but this is for you to understand. If your project is just a simple one and you can manage with this approach, go for it. Do not overcomplicate things. Okay, so let's quickly go ahead and run this and see that it runs successfully. So I'll go to this TestNG XML and run as TestNG suite, and let's see that it runs 4 times this in this run. So launching browser, yeah, you can see first set of data, it has thrown error because there is no account that exists. Should close it, pick. Okay, so let's see what's the issue. It couldn't launch the second set here. Okay, let me check test, because we do not have this browser launch here. Okay, so we have this browser launch here and we have this before test and after test annotation. Okay, so what we are doing here is we are basically saying this is our test. So before test, the browser setup will happen, and after test browser teardown will happen. Now because this is at test annotation, after the test first execution happened, the teardown happened, and because there is no other test, so we have to basically change this, right? So what we have to do, we have to change here, instead of before test and after test, we basically want to launch the browser before this method, before this login test method, and then trigger teardown after the method, so that this launching and teardown happens with this method, not at the test level. So let me change it to the before method, right? And all these concepts that I'm explaining here are explained in that TestNG series, which I will highly recommend before you come to this framework series, because otherwise you won't be able to pick up and you will just leave it in between, because it becomes really difficult to understand where things are coming from. Okay, so if you watch in sequence, it will be really easy to build your own framework. Okay, so now I have changed it to before method and after method. So that launch will happen before this login test, before first set of login test. Tear down will happen, then second set will come, launch browser will happen, and then so on so forth. Okay, so let me run this again, save it and run this and see that this time it runs successfully. So the browser should pick the first set, yes, and it couldn't find that account, so that could, it should close the browser now and move on to the next set, and it's launching the browser again. As you can see, yep, this is the second set of data that will be picked from the data provider. The third set, yeah, this is the fourth set, I think, logging in, because the fourth set was the correct set of data. Close the browser. Yeah, so now you can see that there are 3 failures, right, and 1 pass, because the data set that we have provided, right, contained 3 invalid data and 1 valid data. Okay, so if you want to basically see the details, right, so if we go to the TestNG, right, you will see that it has basically picked up this data here, right, so it basically was not able to find the element, and which is correct, because we are providing invalid set of data, and with invalid set of data it is not able to find the correct identifier, and it's failing, right? So 3 set of data was invalid, and then 4th one was valid, and it executed that data set. The key point here is to understand that with the data provider, we can provide the data to our script, and we don't need to hard code any data here, and we can perform data driven approach or data driven testing for our test case, right? So now, say for example, you want to perform testing for different user combination for login test, you can just extend this data set here, and with one set of test case, you can do those execution for multiple scenarios. Right. If you want to have a look at the reports as well, so by default, because we are using TestNG, so it creates the report in the test output folder, right? So if I simply right click and refresh, you will see this index.html. Simply open it and you will see that it will create the report for you, right? So basically it's a very raw report, but this is good enough for you to basically see, go ahead and what exactly the execution has been. There is emailable report as well, which will show you what has been passed, what has been failed accordingly, right? So you'll see the number here. So very basic report, but good enough to start with. In terms of reporting in our framework, we'll be implementing much better report as we go along, right? So this is basically about the data provider and removing the hard coding of data from our script, and how we can use data provider to perform data-driven testing in our test automation framework. So that's all for this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll understand how you can externalize this data to the Excel file and use it into your test cases. That is more robust approach, and that is mostly what you will be using in your framework. This approach is just to show you if you are having a small set of test cases and you can manage with this data provider, just stick to it. This is good enough for your. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much for watching.